Welcome. My name is Frank DeFalco. I'm an associate director in the Epidemiology Analytics Group at Janssen R&D. I also proudly wear the badge and title of Benevolent Dictator of the OHDSI Architecture Working Group. So over the last 4 years or so, I've been working on the OHDSI architecture and its evolution, inception, and to where it is today. I by no means have been the primary contributor to the code base because it really is a community effort that's been driven by many institutions and organizations. I have happily been along for the ride with everyone, and it's been a lot of fun. Although a bit lonely at times because the group is small, so I was very excited to see the turnout that we have today in this class, because I view it personally as an opportunity to invite you all in to become a part of the architecture working group, to become a part of the evolution of this stack, and what I see as a platform that will enable reproducible research on observational data to generate evidence and help inform providers and patients and ultimately people. I'm someone who thinks that we need to get away a little bit from this idea of patient-focused things, because when is someone a patient? They're a patient when they are sick and they're being cared for. Before that, we're all people. And we should really argue that we're not really in a binary state of healthy or sick, but rather that our health is something we need to monitor over time, and that we're all probably getting a little sicker every day. And we need to try and think about people rather than just patients. Again, I hope what we do here within the architecture working group stays focused on that. So that's the t-shirt of the day, of demand evidence and think critically. What we're doing isn't about the technology for the technology's sake. We can't think about the platform and the technology in isolation. We want to think about it in terms of how we are generating evidence, how we are impacting the healthcare system, and how we're changing people's lives, ultimately impacting the human condition. That was the advice I was given a long time ago when I left consulting and went to join Janssen, was that I could be in a position to help impact the human condition by being in a role like I am now. And I thank everyone here again for being here, for spending your time with us. It's a attention-based economy. You all have many other things you could have spent 8 hours doing today, but you chose to come and listen to us yammer on about an architecture and software and how it applies to observational data. And I'm grateful that you've dedicated your time to that. And hopefully we help everyone get what they want out of this session. We're going to do some early feedback and QA type stuff so I could try to better understand that. We have a full agenda, but we are flexible. We will be able to try to dive into things that people want to talk about. We will have opportunities for discussion. My current plan is not to spend lots of time in code and doing development here. Our plan is to make sure that everyone's aware of what this architecture is, why it is the way it is, where we acknowledge its faults, where we see its potential, and then try to make sure that everyone walks away with what they wanted to learn in coming here. If you didn't have a lot of idea about what you wanted to learn, you just wanted to get your feet wet and understand, that will happen. If you have a really specific question that you want addressed, we will address it. And if we don't get to it today, then I will make myself available to all of you in a variety of ways so that you could get the answers to the questions that you have. So this is our agenda. As you see, it's pretty packed. Once we end, I will be here as long as you want, as long as I make my 7 o'clock train, so I can answer questions. But as an overview, we're going to go through some background as to how an architecture evolved and why we have it. Go through what that architecture actually looks like. We're going to hear from other members of our faculty, which I'll introduce in a minute, on things like BroadC, and Arachne, and demonstrations of software and how development happens. We're going to try to talk a little bit about how your environments look and what it takes to maintain and manage those environments, what best practices we can try and provide more transparency to on how your architectures and environments are managed. Talk a little bit about the roadmap, both looking back at some of the things that we believe we might have done wrong or we could do better, and looking forward to the types of things that we think can be solutions for us in the future, and gauging some interest on other platforms and technologies. Admittedly, I don't know everyone in the room. In fact, I don't know most in the room. So I am going to try to learn as much as I can about you and your needs throughout today, as well as communicate what I can about the architecture as well. So as I mentioned, my name is Frank. Joining me today on the faculty, we have Greg in the front from DCS Data Services, Lee Evans on the other side, LTS Computing, and Sigfried Gold over here from University of Maryland, HCIL. We'll all be presenting different portions of today, and we'll all be available to answer questions during breaks or lunch or what have you. So I wanted to try and give a brief history and introduction around how we ended up with an architecture and why we have an architecture at all, why it's necessary, what impact it can have, and how I played a minor role in being where I am right now. So I originally was a consultant for British Telecom. I was a practice director there for their business intelligence and collaboration group. And I worked on a variety of e-commerce systems, L'Oreal and Lancome websites, Micro Warehouse, for those who might remember that, CDW, a bunch of stuff. And ultimately, in my career, I was seeing a bunch of large data sets and business intelligence platforms, developing cubes, and working with pivot tables. And really nothing had anything to do with healthcare. And frankly, most of it bored me a little bit, and I was not really engaged by it. However, it was a good job and stable, and so I was a happy guy. Somewhere along the way, I woke up one morning with chest pains and thought I was having a heart attack. I got rushed to the emergency room. I was not having a heart attack. I'm fine. But I had this terrible idea that my legacy to the world would be 3-click mascara. Because we were doing clickstream analysis to see how many clicks it took to buy mascara, and that's what I was working on. And that felt really, really bad. So at that point, I stepped out of my role where I was, and I wanted to go back into the field doing consulting instead of managing the consulting group. So I ended up joining Johnson & Johnson's IT group, at that time called NCS, and I worked on a variety of systems for text mining, intellectual property search, patent text mining, probabilistic latent semantic analysis. We were doing fun stuff. When one day, someone dropped a USB drive on my desk and said, "You work with big data sets, please help with this." And it was the premier database on a terabyte USB 1 drive, and it was completely novel to me. So they were SAS files, and the organization was trying to run a query to do some analysis in the orthoclinical diagnostics group to look at how many people had blood tests, to look at PSA values and the distribution of them. But for me, they were just SAS files. What is this SAS thing anyway? Why is it so slow? And why are we trying to read it off a USB drive? So for me, it started with a single study. And I would imagine that for many of you, perhaps it is a case that in your organizations, you're trying to facilitate access to some data and base it off of some single study's needs. And so that's where I was at the time. And to give you perspective on where they were, it was a non-clinical biostatistics group. They were running SAS on their laptop, connected to this USB drive, trying to run this query. And the query was taking weeks to complete. Not only was it taking weeks to complete, but there was an IT policy where they would roll out patches, which would force a reboot, so then it wouldn't actually complete some weeks. And it just seemed to make absolutely no sense that that's the way they were operating. But for them, their background and their history had been in using a data set in SAS that had 10,000 people's information, and this was over 10 million. And so it was just a different paradigm. It was a different level of data, and it was something that they were challenged by and couldn't really see their way through. For me, it was a data set, so I loaded it into a database. I indexed it. We showed them how to use SAS to use SQL pass-through and ODBC drivers, and now their queries were running not in weeks, not in hours, not in minutes, but in seconds. Right? So we looked like gods, but we really didn't do anything. Like, we just took a database and loaded it and used simple technology to answer a challenge that was otherwise insurmountable for this one group. So for me, at least at that point, the level of interest I had already had by working on patents and intellectual property search, and it was more engaging. It wasn't three-click mascara anymore. But now I'm looking at patient data. And the more I worked on the data set just to optimize their queries, the more I learned about it. And what I learned was that you could do a query and see someone's entire life according to this one data set. You could see who had the flu. You could see who had a heart transplant. You could see how much it cost. You could see if they lived or died leaving the facility. It was engaging. It was something that I could grab onto and felt like what I was working on was meaningful. And so that was, for me at least, a turning point, and that being somewhere in 2007 with this Premier database. Yeah, I haven't worked on anything since. So the last 10 years for me has been dedicated to observational data research, how to facilitate, and how to enable it. And my role in that line has changed significantly. So don't worry, I know I'm at the beginning of the timeline. I won't talk for that much longer. The first thing that I did after facilitating a single study was I was a software developer. That was my background. So I was like, I have to write a tool that does this. I have to write a tool that lets other people see what is in these data sets. And so we developed an application called a patient story. And a patient story was a very simple web application that allowed you to enter into a text box like a Google search an ICD-9 code or the name of a disease or anything. And it would just search the data and find some people that had that flag somewhere on their data and let you look at their story. And my wife had been pregnant and she was watching a baby story on Lifetime, so we called it a patient story. People got excited about it and people started looking at this data set. Again, all based on Premier originally. Our organization decided that Premier was the wrong database. It didn't have what we needed. It wasn't comprehensive enough, so we switched to GE centricity. But the entire application of a patient story was based on the proprietary scheme of the Premier database. So we then were faced with the challenge of, well, we can't use our software on GE centricity, we'll have to rewrite it. So we did, just in time for them to switch to Thin, because Thin was the data set that we were going to use right up until we used GPRD, now CPRD, right up until no, it's Optum. And so somewhere along the way, I was running a group called the Health Informatics Center of Excellence for J&J. And what that group did was facilitate purchasing and storage of all health data sets, all patient-level data sets. And we recognized that every time we had to do an extract to support a study, we would then have to figure out that particular schema of that particular data set. And any tool that we wrote was hamstrung by the fact that it had a different data set underlying it. We couldn't be efficient in anything that we were doing. It was around that time that I joined the OMOP working group, the Observational Medical Outcomes Partnership. I was part of the external collaborator group. I met Patrick Ryan, who was still at GSK at the time, and started learning about the work they were doing to support safety research through OMOP. That's when we adopted the common data model. We have adopted the common data model, implemented it with all of our databases, And I will not claim that J&J uses it exclusively for all of our research, because that is not the case. But we do have over 16 different data sources converted into the common data model. And for our epidemiology analytics group, in support of safety, health economics, outcomes research, business development, and other groups, we run our analyses based off of the common data model. We really have experienced tremendous efficiencies in everything that we do on the basis of using this data model. We'll talk a little bit more about the data model in a little detail today, certainly not to the level that like the vocab tutorials did yesterday. But adopting that CDM really made a huge difference in the way that we were able to operate. 2013, now this is purely just a correlation, but if you were in the main session on Wednesday, we saw that something happened in 2013 where there was less interest in OHDSI, and there was a big fall off of when people joined, and that was also the time I was named the benevolent dictator of the software working group. So again, not causal. I think it's just coincidence. But it was at that time that we had our first meeting at Columbia where we started talking about we need an architecture and we want to have an architecture. And at Janssen we had one. It was purely based on C# and .NET technologies, and we were doing a bunch of development, and we were happy with where we were. Well, we took a vote that fateful day at Columbia, and apparently nobody else likes .NET and C#. Everybody else wants, now we're sleeping. Uh-oh. So we're running like a screen share here to try to get this to work. I don't know why I went to sleep. That's my warning to move the mouse more frequently. Okay, we logged in. It's just going to take a second to update here. So we switched and we started using Java as our platform. We started working on different pieces of software, and the working group was born. Our first piece of software that came out of OHDSI was Achilles. Talk about that in more detail later, followed by a series of individual apps, followed by open sourcing everything, hosting everything on GitHub, and eventually everything coming together under the banner of Atlas, being the web application and a set of services in our web API that enabled access to everything within the platform. So one of the things that I want to point out is that ultimately there are a lot of brilliant people doing brilliant research, and our role, the way we see it within this architecture group, is to enable that, to facilitate that, to democratize access to that, right? There are only so many Mark Suchards and Martin Shumis in the world, and the research that they're doing is great, but if it only ever runs on their laptop, we're not going to address all the issues and problems in the healthcare system. So we need to be able to take that expertise and brilliance, package it up, put it into a component that allows other people to use it safely, properly, with high quality research, and that is what I look at the architecture as trying to enable. And so that goes back to the opening around thinking about this in terms of evidence. Not what software we're using necessarily, but how are we facilitating generation of evidence in support of observational data research. And so, like I mentioned earlier with a patient story, we found that having to redo our work, our analysis, our programs every time we had a new data set was untenable. So a formal architecture meant being more efficient, having standards, having ways to reuse work that had been done, and stop going back to the drawing board every time a new data set showed up. And new data sets are continuing to show up, new structures of data are continuing to show up. We heard interest in the Wednesday session around outside of claims and EHR. What about omics data? I have people in my organization who are thinking about microbiome data. How do we start allowing these other data sets to come in? How do we allow ourselves to leverage things like feature extraction and propensity modeling and population effect estimation and the patient level prediction tutorial that's going on next door? How do we enable all those things on all these different data sets? And the only way we're ever going to make progress as a community is to adopt standards where we're all comfortable, where we know it supports what we need, and put together an architecture that allows us all to work efficiently within those tools. Maybe not so brief, but. Shameless plug. I now consider myself and go by title as a computational epidemiologist. When I started the Health Informatics Center of Excellence, it was the idea that there was an intersection between computer science, information science, and healthcare. It made sense. It was the way we were structuring data. It was the way we were managing it. It was an IT-ish function. Somewhere along the way there, I joined the epidemiology group at J&J, and now I participate in running studies on our products and evaluating their safety and efficacy. But I do it in a different way than a traditional epidemiologist might have done it. And I never want to accuse anyone of not doing it the right way. There's just things that are changing in the way that we are doing research on the basis of the data, the scale of it, and the tools that we have available. So computational epidemiology is this area where I feel like I am playing. I invite others to come play in. It's a space where what we're doing is focusing on the evidence through the architecture. Okay, so jumping ahead now to trying to learn more about everyone here. So Patrick had said on Wednesday that everyone's at a different stage. We're not all on 16 versions of a fully converted CDM v5.1 infrastructure with all the tools deployed. And I want to try to understand from you where you're all at and where your needs are and how we could start addressing them. So we have live polling. So for those of you who are online, on phones, on your computers, you could go to this pollev.com/Odyssey site or text and start answering some of these questions. Hopefully things start showing up on the screen. Hooray, they are. So my first question to you is, how would you describe yourself? I want to try to understand for the people in the room what your backgrounds are and how you fall into this list. Hopefully there's not too many others, but if there are, I'd at least like to try to understand what I left out. I am surprised to see the number of people identifying as software developers. So for those who are software developers, how many people, by show of hands, because I'm not as cool as John Duke and have automatically prompted somebody to facilitate my next question, but by show of hands, how many people consider themselves front-end developers? You develop clients, software, web interfaces, stuff like that. How many consider themselves back-end developers? How many of those are web service layer stuff? How many are database stuff? So a lot of data people, a lot of service people, few client front-end people. Okay, that helps. How many architects? All of them. Next question I want to ask is, tell me about your access to patient-level data. One of the things that we see frequently is people who want to contribute and learn about this space, but aren't sitting on a lot of patient-level data. And so how many of you have none? How many of you have some in a native format that you got from wherever you got it or collected yourselves? How many have CDM v4 and how many have CDM v5? You'll notice bears is not an option on my list of answers. Great. For those who are in the proprietary format, is conversion to CDM something you're in progress with, thinking about, or other? Anyone wants to volunteer?
In progress, so we have first results, but we are still on our way into converting the full clinical data warehouse.
Great. Anyone else?
Same spot.
Same spot. to starting? Good, okay. So certainly everything I spoke about earlier about the efficiencies you gain are what is ahead of you. I do know the challenge of converting data into the CDM format. It's not always easy, but there is a lot of guidance and a lot of help out there. Plugs for, if you've ever met Erica Voss, who's been here this week, she's done a ton of them. On the forums, there's people who will jump in quickly. There's a lot of open source software that we've already published about how to do conversion, so that's certainly something that you could hopefully take advantage of. Our next question. For those people who are with data, what is your current platform of storage for your relational data?
Is there another category?
Oh, what did I leave off?
So we're working with some of our clients on putting things in a different sort of structure. It's Smart Logic. It's a
Okay.
NoSQL platform.
Okay.
Netezza.
Netezza? Netezza and Teradata? Okay. Homespun. So Netezza, Teradata, not currently supported platforms within some of the stack. Thoughts? For those who are on Netezza, Teradata, when you look at the OHDSI stack and you see that it's not publicly declared as something, is it slowing you down? Is it stopping you from adopting? Is it something that you are looking to contribute to something like SQL render, which is the thing we use to translate dialects?
So I just saw that database connector module.
Mm-hmm.
It had Netezza in there, so that was a new update I saw. But I had a problem connecting to the database.
Yeah, and whether
In general, the dialect is not very different from Postgres if you are doing very simple things. If you want to go do more complex, more advanced type of queries, yes, there are several differences.
We were able to successfully connect Netezza at Blue Cross. We used the Redshift approach, where we put our configuration on Postgres, and then have our CDM and our vocabulary on Netezza. And like you're saying, there were very few SQL render statements that we had to make to transition the code to work on Netezza.
great. Okay.
It was a little bit more of a challenge for DB2 on Z.
It is definitely a challenge to keep it going as the community moves on, keep in sync with the community.
Mm-hmm.
So, if there is any IBM engineers in this room, we would love to partner just like Cloudera did.
Yeah. So we are not opposed to trying to extend the list of supported relational platforms for where you're storing your patient-level data sets. In fact, just in this year, Impala and Google BigQuery came into the fold. So it is largely community-driven, meaning depending on where you are and what resources you have, we would hope that if you are using a data set and you're the only one using that relational platform, or you're a group of people using it, that you work to try and extend the existing tools, specifically in this case, database connector and SQL render, to support your platform and your dialect. That being said, we will help. We will try and point you in the right direction. We will help contribute code. We will help debug. We will help try to show you what it takes in order to get things to be compliant. To have us go and list a platform as a supported one. So we have no biases here other than where we all live and what we have, and that's where energy has gone up until this point. But we are fully supportive of trying to allow everyone to participate regardless of their relational database architectures. Limited options here, no other. Do you have Atlas deployed? That's different than I thought. I will adjust my prior. This next question may be silly compared to this one, or in the face of that one. Do you have Web API deployed? I'm going to guess it's going to look similar. While this is coming up, for those who don't, are there, I know a lot of people from one of the earlier questions don't have their data in the CDM format yet. And until you get there, you're not likely looking to install Web API just because you enjoy doing Maven compilation. So I'm going to guess that that is the primary reason that you are not running the API stack or the Atlas tool. Is there any other reason for people who do have CDMs that they are not currently running the tool set?
I'm a software developer, so I'm trying to install it on my own. Get very close.
Yeah. Okay. Anyone else with, oh, you have a CDM, but you don't have the tool stack deployed? All right, that's great. That's good to hear. Oh, so a question from the front. What else are people using as tools, if not between Web API and Atlas for things, if you have a CDM?
We develop our own tools for it.
Okay.
There's always something to Atlas.
Okay. So some people have proprietary internal tools that they're using?
We're just using it commercially together, and then we just do the visualization tools to query it in a online query. It's just visualization.
Okay.
Right now, for us, the OMOP is just an extract format.
Okay.
But that's what I'm trying to get to here, is to figure out how we simply use it internally and not simply an output to all of us.
Anyone else? Okay, we're getting up to our architecture overview.